If you are exposed to altitude for a prolonged period of time, some acclimation should be expected, and this can potentially lead to actually improvements in endurance performance. So let's talk about that here. So what exactly is altitude acclimation? It's an increase in the performance at altitude because you've been there for a long period of time, so a chronic exposure. So in other words, your performance at that level, so at that altitude level, will approach what it was at sea level. Probably won't reach what it was at sea level, but it'll approach sea level. And then potentially when you go back down to sea level, you could even have elevated performance depending on the situation. And there is some debate to that, which we'll get into. To give some numbers here, with moderate levels of altitude, which is about 2,000 to 3,000 meters, it takes about 3 weeks to acclimate. And for every 600 meters above that, it's about another week to acclimate to that new level of altitude. Your performance, again, will probably never be what it was at sea level, but it will get better. This is especially true once you get to higher altitudes, like above 3,000 meters. These effects of the altitude acclimation will stay after you go to sea level, but they will only stay for a short period of time, about 1 month after returning to sea level. So it's not a permanent effect. Given these potentials for altitude exposure to improve your cardiorespiratory system to handle exercise and how they do remain for at least a short period when you go to sea level, a lot of people try to use this to improve their endurance performance for athletics. All right, so let's talk about this here. Red blood cell concentration in the blood or number in the blood will go up after you've acclimated. This is going to increase your hemoglobin concentration so that you can have more oxygen carrying capacity per unit of blood. This is going to help to counter that effect of the lower partial pressure of oxygen, so the lower oxygen gradient essentially pushing into your blood from your lungs into your blood. So that is all a good thing. This is the main thing people are trying to achieve when they use altitude as a training tool. Some other things that are happening though. You're going to likely get a decrease in muscle metabolic capacity. All right, so this seems counterintuitive here, but when you stop and actually think about training at altitude, it will make sense. When you are training at altitude, because it is more difficult, if you are training intensely, like most athletes who are going to go out of their way to experience altitude are, you're going to actually have a decrease in your training performance, which is going to have an effect on your ability to exercise, right? If you lower your training performance, you're going to lower your fitness level over time. And that's what's going to lead to this decrease in metabolic capacity. So you're going to have a decrease in mitochondrial function and glycolytic enzymes. You're going to have a decrease in oxidative capacity as well. So across the board, decrease metabolic ability, essentially. You're also going to have some issues with muscle function and structure. So a decrease in the cross-sectional area of your muscle. In other words, that muscle is going to atrophy and likely get weaker because of that. Because it is the muscle fibers themselves that are shrinking and you're not necessarily losing capillaries, you're going to end up getting an increase in capillary density because you're having less muscle fiber in a unit of tissue. And you're going to have a decrease in muscle mass, again, going along with this decrease in cross-sectional area due to protein wasting, so muscle wasting that's likely to be something you experience when you're at altitude for a while. Right, so living and training at altitude versus just living at altitude, what is the difference? Which one is more ideal? All right, so living and training at altitude has all the negative consequences that I just mentioned here, while having also these positive ones I mentioned up here. So decreased training intensity, decreased training volume, because the altitude training is more difficult, leading to a decreased fitness level overall. And this is the reason why most people aren't really recommending altitude training these days. However, you still can take advantage of altitude. So you can do this either by living at altitude and traveling down to sea level to train so you don't have those negative effects on your training, or going to a location like this where it's a simulated high altitude environment. This is used for training. Again, I wouldn't recommend this typically for training, but you could just spend your day in an environment like this or sleep in like a low oxygen tent or a low oxygen apartment, something like that, in order to have this effect. So live high, train low. This is the only scheme that for using altitude to benefit your endurance performance that has shown reliable improvements in training and exercise and athletic performance, endurance performance specifically. So again, living high and training high, potentially not so great. Living high but training low, so down at sea level, is much better because you don't have those negative effects on your training. We've talked a lot in this video as well as in this video series about how high altitude environments lead to lower oxygen, partial pressure, and that decreases how much the oxygen is being pushed in your blood, decreasing the oxygen levels floating around your bloodstream, and that's all bad for exercise performance. But there are also other things that come with high altitude environments other than the decrease in atmospheric pressure and partial pressure of oxygen. I'm going to be talking about that in another video.